everyone thought Canada's economic choices were clear. But the events of October 2025 tell a very different story. Dear viewers, this week we examine 3 important developments that raise fundamental questions about how Canada's cities and provinces share resources, who benefits from these decisions, and what happens to ordinary families caught in the middle. In Vancouver, 2,500 brand new luxury apartments sit completely empty, while 80% of residents cannot afford to buy them, the highest level of unsold inventory in 24 years. Across Canada, governments are allocating $700 million into public funds to host 13 FIFA World Cup matches. But as history has shown, the return on this investment may never materialize. In Ontario, Stellantis announced it would move Jeep production from Brampton to the United States, putting 2,000 Canadian jobs at risk. But there's something the media is overlooking. These aren't separate stories. They are 3 symptoms of the same underlying problem. An economy where the large-scale investments are spent on spectacle and luxury, while the stability of the middle class crumbles. Subscribe to get local news that connects the dots between headlines and shows what's really happening in Canadian communities. Let's start with Vancouver's housing paradox because it perfectly captures the contradictions we'll see throughout today's discussion. On October 1st, 2025, the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation released data showing approximately 2,500 newly constructed condominium units sitting unsold and empty across Metro Vancouver. Think about that number for a moment. These aren't old, outdated buildings waiting for demolition. These are brand new, modern condos with premium finishes, floor-to-ceiling windows, and all the amenities developers thought would attract buyers. Yet they sit vacant, representing hundreds of millions of dollars in stalled capital and thousands of square feet of housing that should be sheltering families, but instead remains dark and unused. The first question everyone asks is, how is this possible during a housing crisis? Vancouver has been dealing with severe housing affordability challenges for over a decade. Politicians at every level of government have campaigned on promises to increase housing supply. The mantra has been consistent. We need to build more homes. Developers responded. They built more homes. And now those homes sit empty because an estimated 80% of Metro Vancouver residents simply cannot afford to purchase them. Anne McMullen, CEO of the Urban Development Institute representing BC developers, made a statement to CBC News that cuts to the heart of the problem. The cost that is associated with policies at all 3 levels of government has made it that we can no longer build what people can afford. Let's break down why construction costs have exploded to unsustainable levels. Labor costs for skilled trades have surged as workers become increasingly scarce. If you've tried to hire a plumber or electrician in the past year, you know this firsthand. Material costs spiked during the pandemic and never fully retreated. And here's the number that should alarm every Canadian concerned about housing. Government-imposed fees and requirements at municipal, provincial, and federal levels now represent between 20% and 25% of the total cost of building new housing in British Columbia. 1/4 of the price tag on a new Vancouver condo goes directly to government charges before construction even begins. Development charges, permit fees, community amenity contributions, parkland dedication requirements. These costs have increased dramatically over the past decade as cities try to fund infrastructure without raising property taxes. The market dynamics make the situation even worse. For years, Vancouver's real estate market absorbed rising costs because industry professionals expected prices to continue climbing indefinitely. Developers built projects anticipating strong demand from investors who would purchase pre-construction units as rental properties or speculative investments. That investor activity was the engine driving new construction, representing roughly 50% of all condo purchases. But between 2023 and 2025, investor participation collapsed to just 7% of the market. When half your buyer pool vanishes almost overnight, even the most optimistic developer faces crisis. The remaining buyers, people actually planning to live in these units, simply cannot afford what's being offered. Real estate agents report that developers are now throwing desperate incentives at potential buyers. Free parking stalls worth $50,000, storage lockers, cash rebates at completion, even covering the first year of strata fees. Yet inventory continues to accumulate. Oleg Galyak, a Metro Vancouver realtor, observed that the new inventory tends to sit on the market, while older, More affordable condos sell relatively quickly. This creates a bizarre inversion where the newest, most modern housing stock goes unsold while 20 or 30-year-old buildings have waiting lists. The benchmark price for an apartment in Metro Vancouver stood at $728,800 as of September in 2025. To qualify for a mortgage on a $730,000 condo with standard down payment requirements, a household needs annual income of approximately $160,000 to $180,000. The median household income in Metro Vancouver is around $87,000. The typical household earns about half of what's required to buy the typical apartment. Now here's where this story connects to what we'll discuss next about government spending priorities. Vancouver is simultaneously dealing with unsold luxury condos worth hundreds of millions of dollars, while preparing to spend up to $581 million in public and private funds to host 7 FIFA World Cup games. We'll examine those World Cup numbers in detail shortly, but keep this housing crisis in mind as context. The same city that can't figure out how to make housing affordable for its residents is about to invest more than $500 million in a 3-week sporting event. The irony isn't lost on the Vancouver families struggling to find housing they can afford. If this analysis helps you understand the economic contradictions facing Canadian cities, share this with others trying to make sense of these complex issues. The human impact of Vancouver's housing paradox extends far beyond frustrated homebuyers. When middle-class families cannot afford to purchase homes in the city where they work, several cascading effects occur. First, they're forced to move farther from employment centers, increasing commute times from 30 minutes to potentially 90 minutes or more. Time stolen from family, health, and quality of life. For those of you who remember when Vancouver commutes were manageable in the 1990s and early 2000s, today's traffic reality represents a dramatic deterioration in livability. Second, households spend higher percentages of income on housing, leaving less for everything else. When 50% or 60% of household income goes to rent or mortgage payments instead of the traditional 30%, families cut back on restaurants, entertainment, savings, and the children's activities, reducing overall economic activity. Third, employers struggle to attract and retain talented workers who cannot afford to live near their jobs. Steve Meads, a Surrey-based developer, told CP24 in mid-October that approximately 100,000 approved homes across Metro Vancouver are currently stalled due to financial constraints. These are projects that have received all necessary permits, completed planning, secured zoning approvals, and are theoretically ready to proceed. But developers won't break ground because the economics don't work. They cannot build units at prices people can afford while covering their costs and satisfying bank financing requirements. This represents a complete breakdown in the housing development system. The market mechanism that should connect housing supply with housing demand has fractured, and proposed solutions remain politically fraught. Reducing government fees means less infrastructure funding. Loosening building standards raises safety concerns. Allowing higher density faces neighborhood opposition. Meanwhile, 2,500 new condos sit empty, and 100,000 approved homes remain unbuilt. But let's shift our attention now to a very different kind of investment decision being made by Canadian governments. One that involves sports, international prestige, and very large sums of public money. Because while Vancouver wrestles with housing affordability, both Vancouver and Toronto are in the final stages of preparing to host FIFA World Cup 2026 matches, and the numbers behind this investment deserve careful examination. On June 12, 2026, approximately 8 months from now, Canada will host its first ever men's FIFA World Cup game on home soil at Toronto's BMO Field. This historic moment comes with historic price tags. Canada will stage 13 total matches across Toronto and Vancouver, requiring a combined public and private investment approaching $700 million. FIFA and various economic consultants project this will generate $3.8 billion in economic benefits across Canada. That sounds like an extraordinary return. Invest $700 million, generate $3.8 billion, net a profit of $3.1 billion. But here's what they're not telling you. The track record of mega sporting event economic projections should make every Canadian taxpayer deeply skeptical of those rosy forecasts. Let's examine the actual investment breakdown, starting with Toronto. BMO Field Inn is undergoing renovations totaling approximately $146 million to meet FIFA's requirements. These upgrades will expand stadium capacity from 28,000 to roughly 45,750 seats, through adding 17,750 temporary seats at the north and south ends. The work includes constructing permanent luxury suites, because FIFA mandates premium hospitality spaces, upgrading broadcast facilities to handle the global media operation a World Cup requires, and installing commercial kitchens capable of feeding thousands of VIP guests. Phase 1 was completed in September 2025, with final preparations continuing through early 2026. The City of Toronto projects this investment will generate approximately $380 million in economic activity for the Greater Toronto Area during the tournament. Vancouver's situation, as you might expect given what we just discussed about the city's spending patterns, involves significantly higher costs. BC Place Stadium, built in 1983, the same year the internet's DNS system was invented, if that gives you perspective on the building's age, requires extensive upgrades. According to October 13th reports from the BC Pavilion Corporation, direct stadium upgrades and operating costs total between $171 million and $181 million. But that's not the complete picture. When you include additional city and provincial expenses for security, transportation, fan zones, and operational support, Vancouver's total hosting costs are estimated between $483 million and $581 million. The BC government projects a net cost after expected revenues of $100 million to $145 million. These are taxpayer dollars, public funds that could be spent on other priorities, including perhaps addressing Vancouver's housing crisis we just explored. When you add Toronto's $146 million and Vancouver's roughly $540 million midpoint estimate together, you arrive at approximately $686 million in direct costs, which we're rounding to $700 million as a reasonable total for Canada's financial commitment to hosting 13 World Cup games. Now let's talk about that $3.8 billion economic benefit projection, because this is where historical analysis becomes crucial. Past mega sporting events consistently generate economic impact projections that vastly exceed actual measured benefits. A 2016 study by economists Robert Baudet and Victor Matheson, examining World Cups from 1994 through 2014, found that real economic benefits typically ranged from 10% to 30% of pre-event projections. Let that sink in. Not 80% or 90% of projections, 10% to 30%. Why do projections consistently overestimate benefits? First, they often fail to account for displacement, local residents who leave town during major events or avoid affected areas, reducing normal economic activity that would have occurred anyway. If you've lived through major sporting events in your city, you've seen this. Locals flee to avoid crowds and traffic while tourists arrive, resulting in not much net change in economic activity. Second, many tourist expenditures represent money that would have been spent elsewhere in Canada anyway, meaning it's not new economic activity, but simply relocated spending. A Toronto family that spends $2,000 attending a World Cup match in Vancouver is $2,000 they're not spending in Toronto or on a different vacation. It shifts around the Canadian economy rather than adding to it. Third, the multiplier effects economic models use to calculate indirect benefits often prove wildly optimistic. The theory is that tourist spending cycles through the economy multiple times. The hotel worker spends their earnings at local businesses, which pay their employees, who spend at other businesses, and so on. In practice, more money leaks out of the local economy than models predict. Brazil's 2014 FIFA World Cup provides a sobering case study. Pre-tournament projections suggested $13 billion in economic benefits. Post-event analysis found actual benefits closer to $3 billion, about 23% of projections. And that $3 billion figure is disputed by economists who argue the true net impact was even lower when accounting for public debt incurred to fund preparations. South Africa's 2010 World Cup followed a similar pattern, projections of $7 to $12 billion in economic impact, followed by measured benefits of approximately $1 to $2 billion. For those of you who remember Vancouver hosting the 2010 Winter Olympics, you'll recall that event also fell short of its most optimistic economic projections, though it did deliver important legacy infrastructure that continues serving the region. The pattern is consistent and clear. Pre-event economic projections for mega sporting events are marketing documents designed to build public support, not realistic forecasts. This doesn't necessarily mean Canada's World Cup investment is unwise. There are legitimate reasons to host major sporting events beyond pure economics. The global exposure, the pride of hosting, the infrastructure improvements that serve communities long after the tournament ends, these intangible benefits have real value that's difficult to quantify in dollar terms. But Canadians deserve honesty about likely economic returns. A realistic expectation, based on historical precedent, would be actual economic benefits in the $1 billion to $2 billion range rather than $3.8 billion. That's still a positive return on $700 million invested, but nowhere near the extraordinary windfall being promised. And that raises a question. If governments had presented more conservative economic projections showing smaller returns, would Canadians have supported spending $700 million on hosting 13 soccer games? Or would they have preferred those funds go toward affordable housing, healthcare capacity, infrastructure deficit reduction, or other pressing needs? This tension between spending on prestige events versus spending on everyday needs for ordinary Canadians leads us directly to our third story today. Because while governments debate whether to invest hundreds of millions in sporting spectacles, and while luxury condos sit empty in Vancouver, working-class families in Ontario are learning their jobs are disappearing. And unlike empty condos or FIFA tournaments, this story isn't theoretical. It's immediate economic pain landing on real households. In early October 2025, automotive giant Stellantis confirmed they're moving Jeep Compass production from their Brampton assembly plant to a facility in Toluca, Mexico. This decision puts approximately 2,000 Canadian manufacturing jobs at risk. For families working at that plant, and for the broader Brampton community where those paychecks support local businesses, generate tax revenue, and anchor middle-class stability, this represents a potential economic catastrophe, and it connects directly to the housing and spending priority issues we've been discussing. Because here's a cruel irony. The manufacturing workers potentially losing their jobs in Brampton are the exact demographic being priced out of Vancouver's housing market. They're middle-income families earning $60,000 to $90,000 per year, precisely the group that can no longer afford to buy homes in Canada's most expensive cities. And they're the families watching governments spend hundreds of millions on FIFA tournaments while their jobs vanish. Let's understand what's happening with Stellantis and why it matters. The Brampton assembly plant, located in the Greater Toronto area, has been producing vehicles for decades. It currently manufactures the Chrysler 300, Dodge Charger, and Dodge Challenger, all large sedans and muscle cars whose market demand has declined as North American consumers shift toward SUVs and trucks. When demand for your products falls, manufacturing plants face difficult choices. The October announcement revealed Stellantis is phasing out these sedan models and moving the plant's other major product, the Jeep Compass SUV, to their Toluca, Mexico facility. This leaves the Brampton plant without a clear production assignment and approximately 2,000 workers in limbo. Why Mexico instead of keeping production in Canada? The honest answer is labor costs. Mexican manufacturing workers earn significantly less than their Canadian counterparts, often 1/3 to 1/2 the wages. For multinational corporations operating in a globally competitive industry with thin profit margins, that wage differential translates into hundreds of millions of dollars in savings over a vehicle model's production life. Add in Mexico's trade agreements through USMCA, the updated AFTA, and the economic logic for moving production becomes clear from a corporate perspective. From a Canadian worker and community perspective, however, this logic is devastating. Those 2,000 jobs represent not just 2,000 paychecks, but also 2,000 families' mortgages, car payments, grocery budgets, children's education savings, and retirement security. The ripple effects extend far beyond the plant itself. Economists estimate that every automotive manufacturing job supports approximately 5 to 7 additional jobs in the broader economy. Suppliers, service providers, local businesses where workers spend their incomes. If 2,000 direct jobs disappear, the total employment impact for the Brampton and Greater Toronto region could approach 10,000 to 14,000 jobs. local restaurants where plant workers eat lunch, the grocery stores where they shop, the gyms where they work out, the daycares their children attend. All these businesses face reduced customer bases. Property values near the plant may decline as worried workers consider relocating to find new employment. Municipal tax revenues fall as both workers and local businesses earn less income, forcing cities to either cut services or raise taxes on remaining residents. For middle-class stability, manufacturing jobs have historically played a crucial role. Unlike service sector jobs that often pay minimum wage or slightly above, manufacturing positions typically offer middle-income wages, $25 to $40 per hour in Canadian auto plants, along with benefits, pensions, and job security. These are the jobs that allowed previous generations to buy homes, raise families on single incomes, save for retirement, and achieve what we traditionally called the Canadian dream. As these jobs disappear, whether to automation, outsourcing, or corporate restructuring, the pathway to middle-class life becomes narrower. And here's where this connects back to Vancouver's empty condos. When developers build $850,000 condos, they're implicitly building for high-income professionals, tech workers, finance executives, successful entrepreneurs. They're not building for manufacturing workers earning $65,000 per year. Those workers are being squeezed from both directions. Housing prices rise beyond their reach while their jobs disappear. The question Canadians should be asking is, what are governments doing about this? When Stellantis announced potential job losses, where was the same urgency we see for funding FIFA tournaments or other high-profile projects? To be fair, automotive manufacturing faces genuine challenges. Electric vehicle transition is upending the industry. Consumer preferences are shifting. Global competition is intense. No government policy can perfectly insulate an industry from market forces. But governments do make choices about where to direct investment, what industries to support, and whose economic security to prioritize. The federal government has announced billions in subsidies for electric vehicle battery plants, which is forward-looking and important for Canada's future in automotive manufacturing. But those new plants won't help the Brampton workers losing jobs today. The timeline between job loss and retraining for new industries measured in years, during which families face mortgage defaults, depleted savings, and shattered financial plans. For the 55-plus audience that forms the core of this channel's viewership, this story should resonate deeply. Many of you remember when Canadian manufacturing was the backbone of middle-class prosperity. Cities like Oshawa, Windsor, Hamilton, and Brampton built their identities and economies around automotive plants that provided stable, well-paying jobs for generations of workers. You've watched those jobs gradually erode over decades, first to automation, then to Mexico and Asia, now to new competitive pressures from electric vehicle transition and changing consumer preferences. The 2,000 Stellantis jobs at risk represent one more erosion of the economic foundation that sustained Canadian communities for half a century. Now let's step back and examine these three stories together, because the connections reveal something important about Canada's economic trajectory and priorities. In Vancouver, we have private developers who built housing nobody can afford because costs spiraled beyond middle-class reach. In Toronto and Vancouver, we have governments investing $700 million in a sporting event with promised returns that history suggests will prove overly optimistic. In Brampton, we have 2,000 manufacturing workers facing job loss while corporations chase lower wages in Mexico. On the surface, these seem like unrelated developments, but look deeper and you'll see a pattern, an economy increasingly divided between high-end luxury and low-wage precarity. With the middle-class squeeze intensifying from both directions, the Vancouver housing paradox perfectly captures this dynamic. Developers aren't building affordable housing because government fees, land costs, and regulations make it financially unviable. They build luxury units hoping to attract high-income buyers and investors, but there aren't enough high-income buyers to absorb the supply, especially after investor demand collapsed. Meanwhile, middle-income families, like the manufacturing workers in Brampton, can't afford what's being built even if they wanted to buy. The result? Empty luxury condos and homeless families existing simultaneously, an economic absurdity that reveals fundamental market dysfunction. The FIFA investment represents a different kind of misalignment. Governments can find $700 million for a 3-week sporting event, an expense that will generate temporary excitement but limited lasting benefit for the ordinary Canadians, yet struggle to find funds for affordable housing development, healthcare capacity expansion, or programs supporting workers displaced by economic restructuring. This isn't to argue that hosting the World Cup is wrong or wasteful, but rather to highlight the contrast in priorities. When governments have funds available, where do those funds go? Toward addressing the everyday struggles of middle-class families, or toward prestige projects that generate good headlines and photo opportunities for politicians, but limited direct benefits for struggling households. The Stellantis job losses complete the picture by showing what happens to the middle class when neither housing markets nor government priorities focus on their needs. Manufacturing workers facing unemployment can't afford Vancouver's empty condos. They're not the target demographic for FIFA's hospitality packages. They're economically invisible in an economy increasingly optimized for either high-income professionals or low-wage service workers, with shrinking space for the middle-income stability that once defined Canadian prosperity. For families in Brampton watching their jobs disappear, discussions about luxury real estate in Vancouver or World Cup economic impacts in Toronto must feel disconnected from their reality. Their concerns are immediate and concrete. How do I pay my mortgage if I lose my job? What new career can I build at age 45 or 50? How do I explain to my children why we might have to sell the house? If this analysis helps you understand how these separate news stories reveal larger patterns about Canadian economic priorities, share this with your neighbors and friends who are trying to make sense of these confusing times. Because understanding the connections between housing affordability, government spending choices, and middle-class job security is essential for any Canadian concerned about the country's economic future. As we look ahead to the next year, with FIFA matches scheduled for June 2026, Vancouver's housing crisis continuing without clear solutions, and Stellantis job losses taking effect, several questions emerge. Will the World Cup actually deliver the projected $3.8 billion in economic benefits? Or will it follow the historical pattern of falling short? Will Vancouver's unsold condos eventually find buyers, or will developers face widespread defaults and bankruptcies? Will Stellantis workers find new employment at comparable wages, or will they join the ranks of the downwardly mobile? And most fundamentally, will Canadian governments and markets find ways to rebuild pathways to middle-class stability, or will economic inequality continue widening? The harsh reality is that market forces alone won't solve these problems. Developers won't voluntarily build affordable housing if it's unprofitable. Corporations won't keep jobs in Canada if Mexico offers lower costs. Real estate won't become affordable without fundamental changes to cost structures. These are coordination failures that require government intervention, policy innovation, and collective action. But effective intervention requires first understanding the problem clearly, seeing how housing markets, government spending priorities, and employment trends interconnect to shape whether ordinary families can achieve economic security. For the 2,000 Stellantis workers in Brampton, the timeline is measured in months. For Vancouver residents priced out of the housing market, the timeline is measured in years of waiting, saving, hoping that somehow affordability will return. For FIFA preparations, the timeline is 8 months until kickoff. These different timelines create different senses of urgency, but all three stories are chapters in the same larger narrative about Canadian economic evolution. Where that evolution leads depends on choices made today by governments, corporations, and citizens about priorities, resources, and values. Share your thoughts in the comments, especially if you're affected by any of these stories, whether you're a Vancouver resident struggling with housing costs, a Brampton manufacturing worker worried about job security, or simply a Canadian concerned about where public funds go and whether promised economic benefits materialize. Your perspective matters because these decisions affect communities for years and decades. For those of you who remember when housing was affordable, manufacturing provided stable middle-class incomes, and government investments prioritized everyday needs over prestige projects, today's reality represents a significant departure from that earlier Canada. Whether the path forward leads back toward broadly shared prosperity or continues toward increasing stratification remains an open question, one that will be answered by the choices Canadians make about what kind of economy and society they want to build.